Hello, everybody. I haven't had a coffee today, but I wanted to give this a go. Recently, we were watching the documentary on Franco, the Spanish dictator, on Netflix, which is really good. I'd recommend it. Um, so he was a fascist and he was a dictator who basically ruled Spain for over 40 years. Um, and there were people who were very pro Franco and obviously people who were against him and what he represented. Um, and so that led to a whole conversation about, what do these terms mean, like fascism, and, what are the other terms that we encounter? And, for me, it's really important to have like a little map of so I can understand how the world works politically. And so, myself and my missus came up with a very simple map for our own understanding. And obviously, it is simple. We like to keep it simple and to a certain degree limited, of course. If I'm sure in the comments you feel free to add to our understanding. Um, so basically, the idea being that there's the politics of the left, and then there's the politics of the right, and then and then there's the middle. So when we move from the middle to the left, um, we encounter socialism, say, for example, which would be more centrist, more towards the center, but on the left. And the idea being that the community is as important as the individual. So in socialist type societies, basically the tax rates would be higher because the idea being that we need to invest money in community supports. So while there's a certain amount of individual freedom and flourishing, there's also a well-built community network. A prime example of that would be, say, in France, which is very socialist. They have an amazing childcare, community childcare system. So, there's all sorts of supports for the mothers and the fathers, and they can not just take time off work, but people will come and look after the kids when they're very small. And all of that obviously is paid for by the individual taxes. So there's this kind of balancing, that the idea that the individual and the community are interconnected and equally as important. And then obviously the more further we move out onto the left towards the extremes, we start to meet what's described, say, as Marxism or communism, for example. The idea being, and you see one idea of communism at work, say, in China, where the idea is the individual has no rights. And it's all about the collective. So there is no individual, it's all about the collective. Everything is owned by the government. So you don't own anything, everything's owned by the government. Individual rights and welfare doesn't really matter so much. So that's kind of an extreme position. And then, of course, you can see, like in every position, there are obviously pros and cons, and good and bad. So in communism, they would argue that, well, it allows an equality for everybody to, because if nobody owns everything, the government can distribute the wealth equally for everybody. But that's not the case, human nature. So again, like in communist China, there are maybe 1% of very rich people who control everything and who own everything. Yeah, and individuals have no rights. So that's one extreme. And then as we move back towards the center and over to the right of the center, we, initially, certainly in the West, we'd encounter, say, capitalism. The idea that, the individual goes out and earns his money, earns her money, and therefore has a certain amount of power and control over your life, and a certain amount of wealth. And in many ways, I mean, we're talking about more middle class wealth, I guess, here, because, the more you go into capitalism actually supports individual wealth, not so much community. community in terms of philanthropy. Oh yeah, well, I've made a lot of money, so I'll give some back to charity. Or, I'm creating a business so I can hire some workers and they'll benefit by Keynesian economics, they'll benefit by getting a job. But, I don't like to pay much tax. And, it's really about my own aggrandizement. So capitalism on the right, that's what it represents in many ways. It's a competition for wealth and power. And, the community doesn't really benefit so directly from that. People who are challenged or who can't work or are marginalized, they don't benefit so much. So there'll always be, as we move into the right, there tends to be two-tier systems in society, two-tier healthcare system. So there'll be the public healthcare, which isn't as good as the private healthcare if you can pay for it. Two-tier education, two-tier everything, really. And of course, the further out you move onto the right, and you start to meet, basically neo-capitalism, or the extreme, for example, would be as we said, like Franco, he was a fascist. Fascism. And fascism basically is, where, individuals want complete control of the power and the wealth. And you can see it in countries like America, for example, or Saudi Arabia, super rich, where some people become super rich through capitalism. And in their super richness, then obviously they want to rule. So, when they become like almost like dictators in their mini fiefdoms, we call them neo. So neo-capitalists, neo-fascists. Look at going back to say Hitler or Mussolini or Franco, they were all neo-fascists. So the idea being that I have all the wealth, therefore I want the power and I want to be in control. And you basically, they may be nationalists, like Franco was a great nationalist in the sense that he really helped Spain to thrive because he wanted all the industry to be local to Spain, and so started building up a great economy. So a lot of people go, well, isn't this amazing? And it was amazing. However, he wanted to be the emperor. It's as simple as that. And anyone who went against him was killed or sidelined. So, in terms of thought control in right-wing politics, the further out you get into more fascism, the more there is the control of the media, the control of thinking, the control of the laws, of judges, until basically the emperor sits on their throne. And so, the top 1%, again, say in America, it's probably even less, control 90% of the power and the wealth of that country. Similar to communism, interestingly enough, the top 1% control the power and the wealth, even though the left and the right will argue they're completely opposites. They're just two sides of the same coin. And I always feel that at this juncture in our development, in our evolution in the world and humanity, I say that the extreme left and the extreme right are actually marrying each other in many ways. The top 1%, all of a sudden they want the same things. They want to be the emperor. They want to have all the power and all the wealth, and then everybody else just follows along and control. And people aren't really that important. Certainly not human beings aren't. Individuals aren't really important unless you're working directly for the kingdom, so to speak, on either side. So, I'll probably get myself into trouble for saying this, but I was thinking, well, give us, what's an example of this wedding of power-wise and finance-wise and control-wise of the extremes in our political ideologies? And I thought, wow, maybe the Catholic Church is a good example of an institution that has survived, where there's an emperor, they hold all the wealth, and they control what people are allowed to think and say, basically. Now, it doesn't mean they don't do good things in the world, of course not, just like Franco did. But I mean, how many people have to die because they don't agree with, or how many people have to suffer because they don't have a different mindset or they don't agree with the ideology that's been dogmatized and projected onto them in order to think and believe. So for me, that's a very simple map of political ideology. I fall more in the center myself. I like to think that anyway. And I definitely fall more on a socialist kind of, side of things. I believe that, yes, it's important for individuals to have freedoms and to be able to thrive and prosper, but we also have to, support the communities we live in, and that all the people in that community should be thriving and prospering as well. And obviously some people will fall more to the right, some people will fall more to the left, and then people will be drawn out to the extremes. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is, even though we have individual ideologies about our beliefs in the world, depending on our makeup, this is a whole other video, and our pathology, how we were brought up, and trauma response too, we tend to gravitate towards extremes individually. So if I've had a crap upbringing, or I have trauma in my life and bad negative experiences that I haven't processed, I will be drawn to extremism. And we see extremism in politics, in religion, in everyday life, in all sorts of areas. But my pathology, kind of moves me on the political spectrum as an individual, in many ways. And so the more trauma or neglect, or, the negative environment that people grow up in, the more they actually are drawn out to the extremes. And unfortunately, politicians and dictators and other people who like to control people know that the more you can draw someone to an extreme, to one side or the other, the easier it is for them to control them. Because, in order for me to hold a position on this side, I have to demonize and hate the people over on this side. So you see it in America for years and years and years. Socialists and communists were the enemy of the state, the absolute enemy. And so therefore, that hatred engenders taking a polarized position. They're the enemy, we're the solution. And of course, in the same way, in China and in Russia and in other countries that support a more socialist or communist political ideology or viewpoint, therefore fascism and certainly, the views on the right were, very much the enemy. They're the enemy, and therefore, just look at North Korea. They're the enemy. America's the enemy, and the values that they represent. Therefore, we are able to stand behind our position, hating them over there. And it's the same in religion, in fundamentalism. This is fundamentalism, and it causes suffering. It causes tremendous pain. It causes tremendous death in our world. Because in order for me to be right, somebody else has to be wrong. In order for me to believe that my position is the right one and the true one, somebody else has to be wrong. Even in simple belief systems, in order for me to go to heaven, somebody else has to go to hell. In order for me to be good, somebody has to be bad. It's so binary. It's so basic. It's so ignorant and uneducated. And yet so much of our world operates in this way. That, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes education, it takes a tremendous amount of development to bring people into the middle ground ideologically, so that they realize that, it's not one or the other, but it can be both and, at the same time. I can thrive as an individual. I don't have to, in order to thrive as an individual, I don't have to have an enemy in order for my beliefs to believe in what I believe. Somebody else doesn't have to be wrong in what they believe. And I can thrive as an individual as much as the community can thrive as well that I live in, and particularly the more marginalized parts. And until we get to this place in our thinking and in our political ideologies, we are not going to survive as a species. It's very simple. We are at breaking point now in the world. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I cannot see in the next 10 years a civil war not taking place in the United States. Trump is going back in for president again, without a doubt. There has to be a civil war because they've become so polarized in themselves. Up to this point, America has always been at war with somebody outside of themselves, and until finally the war machine is eating itself, because that's what happens, isn't it? You know, the hatred, that the polarization that has been created politically, us against them, which was always somebody outside, is now eating itself alive. And it's between Republican and Democrat politically in America. Democrats tend to be more on the left politically. Republicans tend to be more on the right. They've become extremely polarized of late. And it's only a matter of time before there's civil war, and then the whole world will be thrown into chaos, absolute chaos. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in, because people do not know how to come into this middle ground. And yet there are many in the middle. There are many in the middle, but it's much harder to maintain that middle ground. That it's so much easier to just pop back out onto one side or the other and you know, take a position. I'm right, you're wrong. It's so easy to do that. And maybe as a species, this is where we need to really grow and mature. We really have to grow and mature, because otherwise we're just going to annihilate ourselves. So without all the doom and gloom, you know, I find that a very simple, easy map for myself to understand where political ideology, how it works. Now, obviously, there are whole processes in terms of how people can move more to the left or move more to the right, or what brings them more into the middle and so on. But that's not what I'm here to discuss. I'm not a political scientist, but I like to have a simple map in terms of ideology. I hope it helps. If you'd like to educate me some more around it, please leave a comment, or if you like the video, please subscribe to my channel. This is another video on activism for me, which I think, you know, is my contribution to trying to educate and bring these ideas forward in the world. If you're not going to be constructive in your comments, then please don't comment. I moderate them all anyway, so don't worry. And thank you very much for listening.